Hi. A couple of months ago, one of my kids came to me with the iPad, and I said, "Oh, what are you doing?" He said, "I'm playing the newest game from Angry Birds. It's a car racing game." I said, "Oh, wow, let me see that." And I looked, and I saw something, and I said, "Do most apps have $99 in-app purchases for kids' games?" And he said, "Yeah, I've seen those before." And he took me to another app, and then another app where we saw these, just what to me seemed to be gigantic and unimaginable in-app purchases in games for kids. And these weren't explicitly games for kids, but they were games that a lot of kids like to play. So that got me thinking, what's going on? We're making money as app developers, or other app developers are making money by setting things up that as you probably heard, gets us in trouble and led to a big ruling against Apple that we just saw, where Apple had to do some reimbursement of people for their in-app purchases. So there are a lot of other things that you see when you sit on Twitter as much as I do and watch the conversations that are going on, and a lot of them have to do with different people's views about morality and ethics. So I thought that it would be worth squeezing another session into the conference to talk about this with someone that I discovered as I was just searching around on the internet for resources. The resource that I found was a course on ethics for software developers that a professor at Santa Clara University, Shannon Vallor, has created. Shannon is an associate professor of philosophy at Santa Clara University, just down the road. She's appointed at the Markkula Center of Applied Ethics. Markkula is a name you would know if you were at the Mac 30th celebration last weekend. So I asked her to come and was really fortunate to find that she could make room on her schedule and come and talk to us. So I want to introduce her now, Shannon Vallor, and we're going to have a conversation about ethics for app developers.
Thank you. We got a live mic. Everyone hear me? Okay, good. And just need the projector to. Oh, well, that'll do it. Okay, so my involvement in this issue has grown over the course of a couple of years. I teach the philosophy of technology and philosophy of science, and apparently the philosophy of verdant forests.
Why don't we pause for just a moment?
There we go. Great, thank you. So I teach the philosophy of technology, philosophy of science, and also a course called Science, Technology, and Society that deals largely with the social and ethical implications of emerging technologies. And my students responded so positively to that course that my own research began to turn more in this direction. And I began writing on the ethics of social media, the ethics of emerging military technology, automated systems, drones, and so on. And increasingly, I began to realize that as an academic, I have a very limited impact unless I am able to engage with the communities outside of academia that are actually doing the relevant work and rolling out the relevant technologies. And this is an incredibly exciting challenge, but a difficult challenge for an academic to reach those audiences. And one conversation that I had last year with Irina Raiku, who is the Internet Ethics Program Manager at the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics, and she's here with me today, if you want to wave in the corner there, Irina. She came to Santa Clara and to the Marcus Center and started talking with me about the gap in undergraduate engineering ethics education for computer science and software engineering majors. And the difficulty of finding room in a curriculum and overcoming the resistance and fear, I think, of a lot of faculty to introducing this material in their courses when they may feel like they don't have room in the course, or they may feel that they aren't sufficiently experts themselves on whatever software engineering ethics is. So we decided that we would make a first foray into filling this gap, at least the tiniest bit, with a downloadable free module, teaching module, an introduction to software engineering ethics, that we would make available on the Markkula Center site for anyone around the world to download and use for free, with some survey questions at the end to give us feedback so that we could keep improving it. And because of some connections between the Markkula Center and Arvind Narayanan, who is a computer scientist at Princeton University, and some of you may know of his work with Do Not Track and so on, we decided that we would build this and roll it out and see what the response would be. And Arvind co-wrote the introduction of the module with me, and there's Irina's bio right there, and Arvind's right here. He is the world's most wired computer scientist, according to Wired magazine. So that's what I call him. So we actually got a very interesting response. So first thing that happened is that Pacific Standard magazine wanted to write a story about the module. And this was also picked up by Slate as well. And then more recently, the Association of Computing Machinery, the ACM, asked Arvind and I to write a column about software engineering ethics education for their communications. And that's going to come out in March right there. That's just a proof. Right now, the modules being used, the numbers may have gone up since I last heard, but my current understanding is that it's being used in 17 different universities on 3 different continents. And the modules intended to be a short few days inserted into a course that might otherwise not have any ethics content. So this is the chain of activities that led me to be on the internet as someone who can talk about these things, so that Tim could find me and bring me here. So I'm really excited to be here, and I hope that we can have a good conversation about these issues. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about software engineering and developer ethics. I realize that these are somewhat distinct but overlapping issues. And I want to talk about them, first of all, in 2 ways. First, as a form of professional ethics, and secondly, as a form of personal ethics. And these are mutually reinforcing ways of thinking about software and ethics. So let's start with professional ethics. So first of all, why do professions involve ethical duties? Well, ethical duties in professions are connected to the very thing that makes something a profession. And there's a lot of debate about whether software development or software engineering really is a profession. A lot of developers don't tend to think of themselves as belonging to a profession, which carries connotations of a very sort of institutionalized, formal system of work that might not match up with sort of the freewheeling culture and creativity of the software engineering environment and the software development environment. But it is a profession, and I'm going to explain why. All professions, so think of the classic examples: the legal profession, the medical profession, the teaching profession, the military profession. We could list many more. All professions secure important public goods, goods that are necessary for a good life, goods that belong not just to individuals, but to the public as a whole. The kinds of goods that are required for any community to flourish, any human community anyway. So the kind of goods I'm thinking of, corresponding to the professions I've named, justice, health, knowledge, security. This entails a moral responsibility to the public. Because if you are providing or securing those goods that the community needs in order to flourish, then you have an inherent intrinsic moral responsibility to secure those goods responsibly and in a way that takes the public welfare into account. And this is why ethics is such an important and central part and a formally accepted part of medical practice, of legal practice, of military practice, of academic practice, and so on. Now here's the key point. Today, all of these public goods flow through channels designed, built, and maintained by software engineers and developers. So it's not just that you are one profession among many. Software and those involved with the life of the internet are increasingly the channel through which all public goods flow. It's not the only way these goods can be accessed, but increasingly it is the way that people seek to find the things in life that they need to flourish. And then we have other public goods flowing through the channels that you guys built that normally would flow through other channels: privacy, wealth, and social capital. It's a term that sociologists use quite frequently to talk about the power of social connections and the way that those can be seen as a form of wealth. So you in this room have your hands and your tools have a grip on all the kinds of public goods that people count on in order to live well. That's where the moral responsibility comes from, and that's where the professional status comes from. So what are professional ethics? They show us how general moral standards, such as integrity, honesty, courage, wisdom, care, and so on, they show us how these things look when applied to the specific context in which we work. And that's really important, because just having someone tell you, be honest, isn't that helpful if you don't know what honesty looks like in the context of developing software, or what integrity looks like in the context of disclosing information to your users about what's being collected in terms of their personal data, right? So professional ethics is a way of taking the general moral standards that we all have to live up to and showing each other how those standards actually manifest themselves in our daily professional life. Okay, but it's also important to think about this form of ethics as a personal ethic. Work is a core part of our moral lives and character. Some of us try to compartmentalize it, set it aside from our identities as parents or siblings or spouses or friends. But really, considering how many hours we all spend working compared with the hours we spend doing other things, there's probably nothing more central to who we are in the modern contemporary era than our work. So it is a personal ethics because you cannot separate the work from the person. Now, there's a basic moral norm which I won't claim is a universal one, because any philosopher who claims that something is a universal moral norm just might as well paint a big target on her chest. But a basic and quite common moral norm is the desire to make an honest living, which is just a sort of metaphor for a way of life that is fundamentally ethical, a professional way of life that's fundamentally ethical. We might compare this, for example, with the explicit concept of right livelihood in Buddhism, but there are more sort of tacit notions of being ethical in your work as something that also allows you to be ethical as a person. All of us hope that our children and parents and so on will always be proud rather than ashamed when they describe what we do, right? So this is part of our identity, our self-image as moral people. Also, and this is very important, personal ethics help us to think through work situations for which our professional codes of ethics have not prepared us, right? Life always brings with it unforeseen and sometimes unforeseeable ethical challenges, novel situations that the standards that we have evolved as professionals might not have caught up to. And personal ethics is what ensures that we are in the habit of thinking about how to respond to those kinds of unprecedented situations in ethical ways. so that we're not just relying on a formal set of memorized rules or practices that might create blind spots where ethical responsibilities exist. Also, personal ethics help us to integrate the different aspects of our character, roles, and self-image, to be a whole person as opposed to a fragmented one. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about ethics and society in the context of software. So, philosophers will tell you that ethics is fundamentally about the good life. That's the nutshell, right? And we can get into a lot of abstract theory about what that amounts to, but ultimately what we're talking about is, what is it to live well? What is it to flourish? Now, software developers and people who market software sell a particular image of the good life. And you guys know all the buzzwords that are being used to sell that image right now. The good life is mobile, it's social, it's smart, it's shareable, it's trackable, it's on demand. Fill in whatever buzzwords you like that I've left out. If developers fail to think about ethics, that is, whether their products are actually good for users and for society, if they actually promote the good life, if they fail to think about that question, this image will come to be seen as unattractive, a marketing lie or mere gimmick, as opposed to a meaningful promise of something worth having. And it's important to remember, and it's especially important to remember now when the software industry is really sort of coming into its own and really seems indispensable to the way we live, okay? It's important at exactly that moment to remember that no industry is immune from the ethical judgments of the society of which it is a part. I want you to think about the reputation and image of tobacco companies and tobacco ads and products. Consider the difference between how those companies and their products were seen and the people whose professions were tied to these products. Consider the difference between the 1950s and the 1980s, when the tide really started to turn, and today. So, something that can be seen as central to the good life or to our own self-image can come to be seen as pernicious and poisonous, especially if it comes to be perceived that the people involved in developing and selling that product don't care whether their users flourish and thrive or whether they suffer and are victimized. And I probably don't need to make note here of the Google bus protests in the city, the way that urban tech workers have been demonized in certain corners of the media in recent months. And there really is not reason to panic, but reason to at least perk up our ears and be concerned about whether there's a certain canary in the coal mine sign here that the public is not fully convinced that this industry is sincerely concerned for their welfare and interested in promoting the good life. And remember also that tech consumers are notoriously fickle. Above all kinds of consumers, tech consumers demand products that they believe help them to live well, and they reject those that for whatever reason do not. So think of the teen Facebook exodus when people recognize that they don't really want mom and dad to have access to their updates. And then I want to just emphasize that people want to live in an ethical world. Even dishonest, antisocial narcissists want the world around them to be honest and attentive to their needs. So you really have to ask yourself, you can be as cynical as you like about whether your users are ethical, whether your coworkers are ethical, whether anyone is ethical. It doesn't matter if anyone is, everyone wants an ethical world, and they want the products they use to be designed by people who are attentive to their needs and concerned for their welfare. So you still have to ask yourself, no matter how cynical you are your apps shaping a world that people will want to live in? Let me say a few things about apps and ethics. Often, depending upon the size of your enterprise, there may be fewer fail-safes or levels of oversight than you would find in other engineering contexts. So code may be deployed without a great deal of institutional review, which places more responsibility on those who do get their hands on it to make sure that, that due diligence is taken. Also, developers are often in the best position to know how the technology may be affecting users. Ethical reflection can't just be handed off to ethics specialists. Engineers have to stay in the loop. The people who know the software and know the code have to be involved, whether it's what they want to be involved in or not. Also, remember the apps are a moving ethical target. Features change, users change, platforms change, contexts change. A benign app can be ethically problematic with a single bug fix or update. That's been pointed out in some of the talks that we've already seen today. Also, ethical issues in general cannot be fully anticipated. Ethics is about responsiveness, not just foresight and prediction. So the fact that you didn't see a problem or even couldn't have seen a problem coming doesn't mean that you don't have an ethical responsibility to respond to it quickly, wisely, appropriately. Also, remember, ethics is not the same thing as legal compliance. Ethics isn't law, and it isn't compliance. They are related, they often overlap. One could argue that law is a formal way of representing ethical considerations that we take to be enduring and of a certain level of significance. But it doesn't replace ethics. Ethics is broader than law, and ethics is something that is pervasive and constant. It doesn't go away. You can't just check off a box with the compliance mindset and forget about it. You can't just write something into a terms of service agreement and then forget about it. So ethics is about a constant mindset of responsibility to those who are affected by the things that you make and the things that you do. There's another reason why ethics can't be confused with law. Laws are slow. Laws have to respond after the fact, and they can only come about after a certain amount of public deliberation has taken place, which is a good thing, right? We wouldn't want laws to be just made on the fly. But there are times when an ethical situation, a crisis comes about, and we have to respond before there's a law that tells us how to do it. And so ethics is required in order to be able to respond appropriately to situations for which the law has not caught up. So ethics then is a cultivated habit of thinking and acting. It's not a set of rules. It's not a checklist. All right, so let's think about some questions about ethics and app development. Now these questions, there are 5 of them, and they came from Tim Burks, to whom I'm very grateful, because I think these were fantastic questions, and they really helped me think about what I could say to you that would stimulate a good conversation. So I'm going to go through some of my preliminary answers to these questions, but I hope that in the Q&A period we can go a little bit deeper. So here's one question, the first question that Tim sent me. How can an app maker set appropriate limits on the amount and kinds of information collected about users? Some of what I'm going to say has already been addressed by the prior 2 presentations, but I'm just going to look at it from an ethical point of view. Well, first, by asking the very question, as opposed to taking the approach of, well, let's just collect and store everything in case we need it later, right? And we know that that's a tempting strategy. So even just recognizing that this question always has to be asked and seriously examined is essential. Consider user expectations. Actual, ordinary users, not ideally knowledgeable, prudent users, not users who know what you know. And that was emphasized in Laura Berger's talk earlier as well. Consider questions of context. Why is this information being collected? Who is it being collected for? How might it get used? Context really matters. Helen Nissenbaum has written a lot about privacy and the notion of contextual integrity, pointing out that norms of privacy shift according to the context that people are in and what expectations are operative in that context. So you have to have a flexible, thoughtful approach to this that recognizes the contextual factors. Consider potential harms. Who could this information hurt? How seriously, right? A minor annoyance or inconvenience technically is a harm, but it's not one that necessarily has to change our practices if there's a significant penalty to be paid for doing that. But there are kinds of harms that we have to sacrifice our own convenience for. So thinking about harms and understanding the range of possible harms is really important. And again, this has to be a habit, something we just start doing automatically. And consider third parties. This has been made clear by the last couple of presentations, also the scandal about leaky apps and the NSA that came out in the last week, right? So it's not enough for you to feel that you're a good actor, that you're a benign agent, or that your company is a benign agent. You have to think about others who could be indirectly affected, by the way. So not just the user, but people associated with the user who might be affected by the information that the user is disclosing. Also think about third parties who might gain or purchase access to the information later. So these are the sorts of things that have to be considered before you can decide what an appropriate limit is. Okay, here's a second question. If an app can make money by appealing to people's natural tendencies and desires, why limit that? Well, most of the time you wouldn't want to, right? I mean, isn't that part of good design? Is thinking about what your users want, what their natural tendencies are, and how you can gear into those? But it's important to avoid what philosophers call either the appeal to nature or sometimes the naturalistic fallacy, right? Natural does not equal good. Also, legal does not equal good, right? I made that point earlier. But this naturalistic fallacy, or this appeal to nature, is something that's far too easy to fall into, to think, well, I'm just giving the user what they naturally desire, and therefore there can't be anything wrong with what I'm doing. Now here's a rather stark example. But look, meth dealers appeal to humans' natural desires. If meth were legalized tomorrow, would selling it be an ethical way to make a living? Okay, we all know it wouldn't. Now, that's not to say that any of you here are selling the digital equivalent of meth. But the point is that simply relying on the fact that you're appealing to your users' natures doesn't get you very far in terms of ethical justification. So here's the question you should be asking. Not is it natural, but is it contributing to human flourishing? This is a term that philosophers use when they talk about Aristotelian virtue ethics, but it's a term that anyone can understand. We all know what it is to flourish. And it's important that flourishing is a time-extended notion, right? It's not just, I feel good right now. I feel good right now, I'm happy right now is not flourishing. Flourishing is, I am getting something that will be of enduring value for a good life. It will allow me to continue to exist in a way that is healthy, happy, satisfying, and so on. All right, third question. If people are left out of my audience because they can't afford the equipment and services that are necessary to access my app, is that my problem? Well, it depends. By the way, the answer to most ethical questions that are formed in any abstract way is it depends. So get used to that. Get comfortable with it. Embrace the it depends. Okay, how critical or basic are the goods that your app provides? This is an important question, right? Not everything that's available is something that is essential to a good life. Are these goods that your audience can't reach, or people outside your audience rather can't reach, are they accessible by other more affordable means? Are any measures being taken to expand the affordability of your product, right? Are you making a cheaper version of it, or are you contributing to other efforts of third parties to make these goods accessible? And does the unequal access magnify existing social and economic inequalities, or does it contribute to the further marginalization of those without access? The answers to these questions make a significant amount of difference. They fill out the "it depends" part. If other people, here's the fourth question, aren't making apps because they lack the background and opportunity, why shouldn't I profit from my advantage? So we know that there's a lot of debate going on right now about whether the developer community is sufficiently diverse, whether it's sufficiently welcoming, and so on. All right, so here's some things to think about. You can profit from an unearned advantage in general without choosing to perpetuate it. So here's some questions you can ask yourself when you think about whether you're choosing to perpetuate this advantage. Are you making the participation of others easier, or are you making it more difficult? Here's some things to think about in connection with that. Who do you choose to mentor? Who do you encourage to enter the field? How do you treat new developers who come with backgrounds that are different from yours or different from the standard profile of a software developer? The answers to these questions can help to tell you whether you are perpetuating an unearned advantage or not. Fifth question, if I'm developing apps on a platform belonging to a big company, can I be blamed for its actions? Okay, you can be blamed for anything. Let's just, you know this, right? Now, whether you earned the blame is a separate question in principle, but you all know that it's not always the case in practice. So think about that. It's not enough to just rest comfortably with the notion that your conscience is clear, right? That doesn't mean that there isn't something that you will be blamed for. So ask yourself, did you consciously or negligently enable those actions of the big company? Could you have reasonably foreseen them? Did you take any available steps to prevent them? And even if you couldn't have foreseen them or prevented them, did you respond once you became aware of them, right? Did you communicate any ethical concerns up the corporate chain before, during, or after? Did you take any other steps to mitigate the problem? Okay, so these were the questions that Tim asked me. These are some preliminary thoughts I have. And I'd like to add to these just, okay, so here's the questions once again. I'll work back and put these back up when I'm done. But I want to just briefly end with some final thoughts or questions for you guys. What are the greatest obstacles to ethical app development from your perspective? I want to know that. Knowing the answers to those questions helps me do my job better. So these are all selfish questions. What useful parallels or important differences exist between software engineering and development ethics and more robust, ingrained cultures of professional ethics like we would find in the medical, legal, academic research, or military professions? Where are these similar and where are they dissimilar? How much of a parallel should we want to draw between them? I'd like to know what changes to engineering education would be most effective in building a more robust culture of software engineering and development ethics. This is something I'm actively involved in. I teach a graduate ethics course to engineers, and I'd like to make sure that it's doing the job. And then finally, what can trained ethicists do to better engage the software community? Where are we falling short, or where could we do more to be helpful to the community in this regard? Those are my questions for you. I hope you'll have at least a few thoughts about that. But that's where I'll draw to a close. You can reach me at these particular locations. I'd love to hear from you.
1, 2, 3. We'll do at least 3.
Hey, thanks so much, and thanks for raising this issue. My name is Thorsten Rauser. I run an app development business, and I'm creating games for more than 20 years. What happened in the last 2 years is the App Store economy, and the App Store even for iOS, has completely turned into a casino. So if you look at the top grossing apps that we have at the moment, it's apps that are actually financed by gambling addicts. Okay, so if you look at Clash of Clans, at Candy Crush Saga, any of these games, they make more than 50% of their turnover by 3% of the people. These are people that are spending hundreds of dollars every month, and it's not rich people, it's poor people. I mean, I'm at the moment in our games industry, I need to manipulate my players to buy in-app purchases. I'm not able to create entertainment anymore to please people, but to be successful in the App Store at the moment, there's no way around it. And most indie developers, many great people, have actually given up because they refuse to get evil. I think one of the most things that really make me feel bad is all these games are allowed for children of the ages of 4 and up. So we're really manipulating children into the system, and I think that's pretty bad. Most people I know in the industry, I will be at the Casual Games Conference in Amsterdam next week, they have a background in the casino industry. And they're like, oh no, it's not gambling, it's gaming. And yeah, and I think we have a pretty bad situation here at the moment. I don't think that anyone will come up with their ethics by themselves.
Yeah.
And I do believe that is a case where we do need a government ruling or something like that. I will be at Apple tomorrow raising exactly the same issue.
Thank you.
So one specific thing also that got me thinking about ethics was a friend of mine told me, hey, there's this great system for getting users to make in-app purchases. It's so good that it was made illegal in Japan. So I'll tweet information about that later. It's called Kapoor Gotcha, and it's a very interesting thing that was done, and it worked really well, and then the Japanese government decided it had to be made illegal. So I saw, the first hands I saw were here and here, and then we'll come back.
We're going to have a discussion about that.
May I respond to that briefly, or do you want me to say?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so I'm really glad that you raised this point, and I think a couple of things I would say. There are cases where, regulation is needed in order to step in. Individual developers cannot overcome some of these problems. The question I think that people need to ask themselves is, what am I doing to join up with others and give voice to our problems with what we're seeing? And are we encouraging, like you said, you're going to Apple to raise that issue. The very fact that you're raising the issue is doing something to try to build some response about this. So are you trying to raise the profile of this problem? Are you trying to bring it to the attention of the people who can do something about it? And are you continuing to try? Or are you saying, well, I tried, but nobody listened, so I gave up, and I'm just going to go back and feed my addicts?
I guess my comment is now kind of related. What role do you see professional licensing playing in ethics? As an example, my sister's a mechanical engineer.
Is it what? I'm sorry?
My sister's a mechanical engineer.
Yes.
So as part of her education, she went through the process. She got her PE, and she is now, she has a license essentially. In my field in software, we didn't even have a process. Software seems to not even know how to approach that issue. Yeah. Would it help if we did?
I think it might, if done the right way. I realize there's a lot of resistance in the community to those sorts of high-level controls on the profession. So the question would be, how could we set up that sort of structure in a way that would actually preserve what works about the software developer community? But there are some things that we can think about, like continuing education requirements that include ethics education, and can help, because see, I can teach ethics to undergraduates. A, they're going to forget it unless it's actually a part of their professional practice. B, when I teach them at the university level, they don't yet know how to apply it in the professional setting. They actually have to learn that from other people they're working with, from peers. And the issues that I raise when they are engineering students are not the issues necessarily that they're going to be confronting 5 years later when they're in the field, or even a year later. So I think continuing ethics education in the profession as a requirement is maybe one step towards putting those kinds of, whether it should proceed all the way to a sort of formal licensing requirement, I'm not sure, but it's something worth thinking about.
So traditionally, professions are granted certain rights by the community. So lawyers and doctors, for example, have monopolies on those particular professions. Educators traditionally have tenure. So if we're going to be professionals, what are our special rights?
That's a great question, and I think that has to be addressed side by side with the question about licensing, right? So one of the ways that professionals are protected is by having something like licensure or tenure, some sort of status that cannot simply be taken by another without meeting certain requirements. So that would be the question of how can we put requirements in place that also benefit developers and give the best people in the profession some form of support.
I need to throw a little thorn in the works for this
Please do.
discussion about profession. A lot of us are into educational apps. We're trying to teach little kids that they can learn to program and make an app. Every man can make an app given, an appropriate, accessible tool.
Sure.
That's very different from the education you need to build a bridge or a medical device or an aeronautical wing. So how does that correspond with
Sure.
delivering professional ethics when we're trying to teach this to kids?
Well, here's what I would say. I mean, certainly you can teach a 12-year-old to design an app. Can you teach a 12-year-old to implement and roll out and maintain an app responsibly? No, you can't, because 12-year-olds aren't full-grown ethical agents. So I think we have to make a distinction between the skills that it takes to create an app and the skills that it takes to actually roll it out and deliver it to the public in a responsible way. So I think it's fine to teach the skills, as long as we don't assume that that makes you a developer in the full-blown sense.
Well, I guess my question is sort of a side issue about how we teach engineers about the maybe unintended side effects of software we release. If we look at sort of the NSA issues going on and how software we all release is used, many of our licenses, like MIT, the MIT license, Apache license, are sort of free-for-alls. You can do anything you want with software. And having been in the financial space and also be previously in academia, seeing some of my own software get into things that I never thought that should be in, weapon systems, for example, how do we teach engineers that we have to be cognizant that, to your point, you can write something, but what happens to it when it leaves your possession?
Yeah, what happens when you sell it? And Irina and I were just talking about this in the car on the way up, about the Chrome extensions that were sold and then used for purposes that the original developer wasn't intending or aware of. So, cautionary tales help, but then that doesn't fully solve the problem, because you still have to know, what do I do about it, right? Are there any steps I can take to prevent it? Is there any steps that I can take to protect users? In some cases, what I might be able to do, just let me reference not your case, which I think is harder, but the case I'm thinking about with the Chrome browser extensions, saying if I can at least notify my users, the people who have purchased this, when I sell the thing, and say, all right, I'm handing this off to a third party, I cannot vouch for what they will or won't do with it, so if you're concerned about it, you might want to delete this, or you might want to inspect the new owner's privacy policies and reputation. So I think that has to be addressed partly on a case-by-case basis, but then there might be some institutional things that need to evolve to make these problems more tractable.
How do we make licenses, for example, such that there are government software do whatever they want and things they find, but how do we then say, well, this license precludes you from using this software in a weapon system or
Right.
violating the human rights of X? Then
How do you make that enforceable? Yeah, exactly.
One of the biggest things in software in general, not as an app developer, so to speak, but that threatens innovation or affects it, is also, and maybe ethics comes in here, but with patents and patent trolls, and kind of what he's saying, and how do you make a license? How is your software used? But in a way, it could threaten the ethical use of software as well when patent trolls come in and scare people away from using software for good or whatever. So that's a big issue in software in general. It's one of our most powerful issues right now, is what happens with software patents in general. Should they be valid? Should they be, and then the trolls that are making money off of them and how they go about that. So.
Right. And I think part of what's true there, and it's what's true with a lot of the issues that we're talking about, is that because of the youth of this community, in terms of its place in the public sphere, right now a lot of people are just sort of doing ad hoc kind of solutions and one-off kind of responses that aren't coordinated with the community at large. And so the question there, we have to be able to involve all of the stakeholders on the legal side, on the corporate side, on the developer side, and figure out solutions that can be implemented more broadly. Because I think many of us are just sort of trying to play catch up to the problem.
So I'd like to ask Laura Berger to just give us her thoughts on this after we heard from the FTC earlier, just to reflect back on this.
Sure, I think this has been an excellent discussion, and it's really given an opportunity to go a step beyond what do you need to do to stay on the right side of the law as you're developing a single app, and think more broadly about what is the direction that your profession should take to make all of these issues easier to address. So many of the things I heard from all of you were, we have so many practical hurdles to achieving compliance. We're working with partners we don't know well. We're accepting tools that are cumbersome to us sometimes and hard for us to feel that assurance that we need. So this is a really excellent discussion in moving forward to address some of those issues.
I would just add briefly that there was a slide up there earlier sort of pointing out that something like 81% of the apps out there, are whatever ethical problems they have are not deliberate. They're not willful, right? So there's a lot of goodwill. There's a strong majority of goodwill to make apps that don't hurt users. And then the question is just, how do we empower the community to actually have that goodwill realized in the products and in the structures that those products rely upon?
Thank you for this conversation. Actually, I want to share some kind of frustration about this topic. A few years ago, I was the top manager of a company which making one of the biggest poker application for App Store, and they in top grossing from very beginning for a few years. So it's a lot of money. And I want to say, I'm from Russia, and it's a lot of enthusiasm to make great apps, to make, to be the good programmers. And all this enthusiasm, when I come to this company, for example, I hire around 15 guys in 1 month, the best from my home city, because I have resources to make so. And
because I'm sorry, I'm having a little. Can you speak just a little bit louder? I missed the last part.
So you have
the 15 guys.
When I started to be the top manager of this company, I have resources to hire guys and big salaries, and we are so enthusiastic about making things. And it's kind of shift because now you have resources, and you can be bad guy because you're programming, you're making cool instruments for other people, and actually these people making casino finally, and it's really for me it's a lot of frustration after this. So after 1 year I quit, but still all my people capital still working in this area, and it feels so strange because I really can't communicate and describe why it's not so good idea actually, because from my point of view, the biggest actually mobile company in Russia, they produce social games, which nothing about social and unsocial by design, and poker and casino. Ouch. So for me, the way out is just quit and trying to make useful application, but actually it's hard to communicate with people who have a big salary now and can now realize capabilities and can be creative and can, making marketing in America, and wow, we are a corporation. So thank you to pop up this question.
Sure, yeah. And I think that's the challenge, is to build an ethical infrastructure into the community that actually allows developers to express their talents and their creativity and their innovation in a way that doesn't require them to compromise their sense of themselves as moral persons.
And so it's interesting, this is really an international issue because we have a developer from Russia who's coming from Hong Kong to the conference, and really a worldwide app market.
Yeah.
To me, it seems like ethics often comes from also good leadership. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about, when you look at the leadership of the government in terms of what's happening with NSA and rolling back net neutrality rules. What does that say about ethics and how, just your opinions on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's really important. I teach undergraduate ethics to students, just not just engineers, but all kinds of students. And one of the most profound problems that I face is just the cynicism that comes built in when they say, well, look, this is the society I'm entering into. Are you kidding me? Ethics, really? Really? Right? And so I spend a quarter trying to undo that sort of cynicism. And in the short time I have, I certainly can't do that. And you're all adults with your own moral worldviews that have matured and not young students who are just thinking about this for the first time. But what I want to say is that if we think about ethics not as something external, where the signals, the bar is set from external authorities, but if we think about ethics as something internal, something from within, something that we need in order to be enthusiastic and resilient and connected with others, then it becomes much easier to be shielded from the cynicism that when we look outside us and we think, oh my God, if our political leaders are behaving morally like toddlers, why should I expect anything more of myself? So I think it's a question of whether you see ethics as something that is imposed on you from the outside or something that comes from something within. Not to get too squishy and touchy-feely about it.
All right, thank you all for your attention and interest in this. We're going to stop now so that we get a nice break, so you can get some fresh air before we pick up again at 2. And thank you very much, Shannon, for
Thank
this.
you. Thank you. And please, if you have any thoughts, questions, suggestions, any answers to the questions that I proposed, please just send me stuff. I don't care how full my email box gets. I'll deal with it. Thanks.